What if the very person who shattered your dreams became the one you were forced to call husband in a remote village in India, where tradition governs every aspect of life? In this village, a young girl dared to dream beyond the limitations imposed on her. She imagined a future filled with knowledge, opportunities to rise above poverty, and a chance to leave a mark on a world she had only seen through stories. Her dreams were bright, filled with hope, but those dreams were soon replaced by something far darker, something she could never have foreseen. In this village, one man held unquestioned respect and authority. He was an elder, someone who had earned the community's trust over the years. To others, he was a symbol of wisdom and guidance, but to her, he became something entirely different. When she sought protection, love, and support from her family and neighbors, she found only silence. Silence that crushed her, stripping away even the smallest hope of escape. Within the shadows of her own mind, something began to shift. Without a voice to cry out, without a path to follow, all she was left with were memories she could never erase, and a resolve that grew stronger with each passing day. What happens when a girl with no way out decides to take her fate into her own hands? In a small village far from any city lights lived a 16-year-old girl named Sahana. From a young age, Sahana was known for her sharp mind and gentle spirit. She was the kind of girl who dreamed even in broad daylight. Her thoughts often wandered beyond the village, imagining herself walking through university gates, carrying books and dressed in the colors of a life she had always envisioned. In her eyes, the world was vast, full of possibilities that could lift her far from the fields where she had grown up, far from the labor that bound her family to a life of struggle. But for Sahana, dreams were luxuries beyond reach. Her family lived in poverty, their survival dependent on each day's earnings. Her father Harish toiled under the scorching sun, breaking stones and carrying heavy loads, his hands marked with calluses from years of hard labor. Her mother, Priya, worked in nearby homes, sweeping floors and washing clothes, her back stooped from the weight of their struggles. They earned just enough to survive, but dreams of education, freedom, and a better life seemed as distant as the stars above their village. Still, Sahana held on to hope. Each night, after helping her mother with the evening chores, she would sit by the small lamp in their home, poring over the few books she owned. Her village schoolteacher often told her parents that Sahana, with her bright mind, could go far if given the chance. While her parents shared in her pride, they also carried the quiet worry: how could they afford to send her away to study when they barely had enough for themselves? It was during these years of quiet struggle that Nand Kishore, a 62-year-old village elder, became more prominent in their lives. Nand was a man who commanded respect without asking for it. His silver hair and stern gaze carried weight among the villagers. Over decades, he had built his reputation, helping to resolve disputes, offering advice that others blindly accepted, and occasionally lending money to those in need. But behind the mask of respect, he was a man who wielded his power for his own gain. To the outside world, Nand Kishore appeared as a guiding figure, a man who upheld tradition and demanded obedience. But in the quiet corners of the village, people whispered stories of his true nature. He was feared, his influence stretching far beyond what anyone dared to challenge. Stories of debts that grew, favors that came with hidden costs, and villages indebted to him for generations were not uncommon. Yet, bound by fear, custom, and a sense of helplessness, the villagers remained silent. One day, Nand Kishore visited Sahana's family. He spoke to her father with a casual tone, discussing village matters and asking about their well-being. Harish, though wary, welcomed the elder, offering him tea with trembling hands. They spoke at length, and Sahana's father, grateful for the elder's attention, began to see Nand as someone who might, perhaps, help them in ways they desperately needed. As weeks turned into months, Nand Kishore's visits became more frequent. Sometimes he came bringing small gifts, a sack of rice, a few coins, gestures that seemed kind, even generous. Sahana's parents accepted Nan's help, unaware they were following a path he had deliberately set for them. Over time, Nan began speaking more directly about Sahana, praising her intelligence and beauty as though her future was his to control. Sahana noticed his gaze, how his eyes lingered unnervingly, and a shiver of discomfort ran through her. She confided her unease to her mother, but Priya dismissed it, chalking it up to the elders' interest in her daughter's potential. In their village, respect was more of a requirement than a choice, and Priya had been taught to honor figures like Nand. The Priya delegation, however, Sahana's unease only deepened. One day, in a moment she would replay in her mind for years, Nan's supposed kindness revealed its true nature. During the quiet hours of the early afternoon, Sahana found herself alone at home. Her parents were out working, earning what little they could to support the family, and her younger siblings had gone to visit relatives. The sun was high, casting shadows that danced along the clay walls of their modest home. Sahana was busy with her daily chores, her mind drifting to distant dreams of school, books, and a life where she could choose her own path. Lost in thought, she didn't hear the footsteps approaching the door. When she looked up, there he was. Nand Kishore. His presence filled the small room, and the air seemed to grow heavy. Sahana's heart stilled as she greeted him politely, as she had been taught to do with elders. He offered a small smile, one that didn't reach his eyes, and stepped further inside. His voice was low as he inquired about her family and the chores she was tending to. Sahana answered, glancing away, a chill creeping down her spine despite the afternoon heat. Nan's tone shifted. His questions became personal and intrusive, touching on matters that made Sahana uncomfortable. She tried to excuse herself and move toward the door, but with a single step, he blocked her path. In that moment, the weight of his authority bore down on her. Sahana looked up, her wide eyes searching his face for a trace of the man the village had once trusted. Instead, she found a cold, unyielding gaze, like iron. Nand Kishore moved closer, his shadow towering over her, and the realization hit her with overwhelming dread. She tried to back away, but he reached out, his rough hand grasping her arm and holding her in place. Panic surged through her, her chest tightening as her mind frantically searched for an escape. But there was none. She was alone, powerless against the man who commanded respect from everyone around her, a man whose reputation shielded him from any scrutiny. She felt trapped, her innocence lost, and her protests were drowned out by his overpowering presence. In those few moments, her world collapsed. Everything she had once believed, the respect for elders, the trust in her community, the dreams of a better life, was shattered. Her innocence was stolen. In all of elders' books, it is stated, left in silence, paralyzed by shock and fear, she lay there, staring blankly at the ceiling. A numbness settled over her, like a dark cloud, while the warmth of the afternoon light seemed to mock her, casting a harsh glare on the emptiness she now felt inside. Days passed in a haze, and Sahana struggled to carry on, trying to piece her life back together. But shame, confusion, and anger consumed her. She couldn't shake the feeling that everyone knew, and that the walls of her village had watched her pain and remained silent. Her world felt alien, her dreams distant memories, replaced by a harsh reality she couldn't escape. Not long after, Sahana began to notice changes in her body. Nausea, exhaustion, and undeniable signs she couldn't ignore. The truth became unavoidable. She was carrying the child of the man who had destroyed her. The news spread quickly, and soon what were once quiet whispers in the village grew louder, voices of outrage and condemnation. Villagers could no longer ignore it. A girl from their own community had been violated. Nand Kishore, the man they respected, the figure they once looked up to, had committed such a disgraceful act that even the elders began to question his place among them. He was arrested, his authority stripped, leaving only the undeniable truth of his actions. The village was split. Some were horrified and rallied to support Sahana, while others hesitated, accustomed to the notion of holding someone as powerful as Nand accountable. The arrest of Nand provided a brief glimmer of hope, a fleeting belief that justice might finally be within reach, that perhaps Asana could find some sense of peace. Yet that hope was quickly extinguished. The elder's influence ran deep, and the pressure began to mount. Sahana's parents, poor and vulnerable, felt the weight of the whispers, the looks from neighbors who expected them to resolve the matter quietly. Friends and relatives urged them to think of their own survival, warning of the consequences of opposing someone as powerful as Nand. Sahana watched as her family's resolve crumbled under the growing pressure. Her father, Harish, who had once demanded justice, began to waver, his voice growing quieter and his gaze avoiding hers. Her mother, Priya, who had once promised that justice would prevail, now spoke in hushed tones, urging Sahana to think of the family and warning that this battle could cost them far more than they could afford. They were poor, without means, and dependent on the goodwill of the very people who had turned their backs. Each passing day, Sahana's hope faded. She came to realize that justice in her world was reserved for those who held power, those with influence. She was merely a girl who had dared to dream beyond her means, and now she was paying the price. The villagers, who had once whispered their sympathies, fell silent, either out of fear or loyalty to the elder. Even the women, those who might have understood her plight, averted their gaze, unwilling to challenge the man who held so much authority. In the end, Nand Kishore was released. He returned to the village with a smug assurance that he was untouchable. His respect faded and replaced by quiet fear, but fear that served him just as well. He continued to wield power over the village, over Sahana's family, over her life. For Sahana, the release shattered any remaining illusions she had of fairness or justice, of a world where right triumphed over wrong. She was forced to watch as Nand carried on as if nothing had happened. The decision made for her condemned her to a life of shame, isolation, and silence. Nand Kishore's release cast a heavy shadow over Sahana's family. Harish and Priya felt the weight of their daughter's plight, but they were bound by poverty and the silent rules of their village. They had no resources to fight against Nand's power, no way to escape the whispers and stares that followed them wherever they went. Each day they heard neighbors murmuring that Sahana should be taken care of. Her presence, young, pregnant, and unwed, was seen as a disgrace to their family. As Sahana's pregnancy became more evident, their desperation deepened. Harish and Priya were already stretched thin, their daily labor barely providing enough to feed themselves, let alone another mouth. The pressure to avoid disgrace weighed on them like an iron shackle. In their fear and scarcity, they agreed to marry Sahana to Nand, convincing themselves that at least this way she would be spared from a lifetime of social judgment, and they would be spared from economic ruin. On the day of the wedding, a 16-year-old Sahana walked down the path toward her new life, her heart heavy with sorrow and betrayal. She felt abandoned by those who should have protected her, condemned by those who should have lifted her up. The village watched in silence, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and satisfaction, as if the ceremony could somehow erase the past and restore order. But to Sahana, it was a betrayal beyond words, a final act that forced her to submit to the man who had shattered her dreams. Minyaro. Life with Nand Kishore was not what her parents had imagined. He saw her not as a partner or the mother of his child, but as a possession. He showed no tenderness, only control, treating her as if her will, her body, and her very existence belonged to him. Each day became an endless cycle of duty, silence, and pain. With her first child, a baby girl, Sahana found a flicker of joy, a sense of purpose as she cradled her newborn. But that joy was soon overshadowed by Nan's indifference. He saw no value in a daughter, viewing her as a burden, and showing no interest in her care. Sahana was left to care for the child herself, struggling to ensure her well-being with little means. Over time, Sahana's health began to decline. She was worn, exhausted, constantly struggling to care for her child under Nan's neglect. Then, as if to remind her of her powerlessness, she became pregnant again. Her second pregnancy was harder, her body weaker, but Nand showed no concern for her or the child she carried. He left her to manage, to cope, to endure, acting as though their well-being was an afterthought. In those long, silent hours, Sahana's resentment deepened. She watched as each day drifted further from the life she had once dreamed of, a life filled with education, choices, and love. She saw the way Nand looked at her, eyes devoid of warmth, only the expectation of submission. She felt the weight of her parents' decision, the suffocating reality of their poverty, which had bound her to this man. Each passing day, her sorrow transformed into something sharper, a quiet, simmering hatred that took root in her heart. The morning after Aaron's death, Igraine spent some time transferring paintings from the pictures of her daughter's birth. Years passed in silence, filled with unspoken pain, and Sahana found herself growing distant from the life she had once known. She felt like a stranger in her own body, her own home, her own village. The friends she once laughed with now avoided her, their faces clouded with pity or judgment. Her family, though nearby, seemed worlds away, bound by the fragile peace they had bought at the cost of her freedom. The dreams she had once held, of studying, of walking the grounds of a university, of building a life filled with choices and love, became ghosts, haunting her at night and vanishing with the first light of dawn. Sahana was alone. Her days were spent in silence, tending to her children, enduring Nan's cold presence, his constant reminders of her submission, and the emptiness of a life that felt more like a sentence than a marriage. She was isolated, her voice lost, her heart hollow, echoing the girl she had once been. Each night, as she lay in darkness, the weight of her sorrow pressed down on her, threatening to consume her. But as the years wore on, something within Sahana began to change. It was subtle at first, a quiet rebellion in her heart that went unnoticed by those around her. She found herself unable to bear Nad's commands with the same silent acceptance. Her gaze shifted from the floor to meet his eyes, carrying a defiance that simmered beneath the surface. When he ordered her to serve him, she took an extra moment, letting her silence linger, refusing to acknowledge his authority. She began to resist in small, almost imperceptible ways. A slight pause, a look that spoke more than words ever could, a refusal to cower under his gaze. These acts of rebellion were small, almost meaningless to anyone but Sahana, but to her, they were victories, moments of reclaiming the control that had been stripped away. She would look him in the eye, her expression betraying none of the obedience he expected. She moved through the house with a new resolve, each action slow and deliberate, a quiet reminder to herself that she was not yet defeated. Yet, with each act of defiance, her resentment grew, and she began to see Nand Kishore not as an elder, not as her husband, but as the embodiment of everything that had been stolen from her. Wouldn't you love to subscribe right now as this documentary gets even more interesting? He was the reason she had been torn from her dreams, isolated from the people she loved, and left to live a hollow existence that no longer resembled the life she once imagined. The hatred she carried grew deep within her soul, expanding with each passing day, each slight, and each reminder of her lost freedom. There were moments when she felt she could endure no more, staring out the small window of her home, watching the world she once believed held promise slip further away. She realized there was no escape, no future beyond the confines of her marriage, no chance to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Her parents had turned a blind eye to her suffering, and her village had passed judgment, leaving her with nothing but the cold certainty that her life would be bound, silent, and unseen. In the quiet of those endless days, Sahana's thoughts drifted toward darker fantasies, imagining a world without Nankishore, free from the suffocating control he exerted over her. She pictured the life she could have lived had he never entered her world, the paths she could have taken if he hadn't stolen everything from her. With these thoughts came a new realization. Perhaps her only way out was through him. Her resentment hardened, transforming into something more potent and dangerous. No longer did she seek a life of quiet rebellion or passive resistance. She wanted true freedom, and she knew the only way to achieve it was to rid herself of the man who had become her prison. In the stillness of her mind, Sahana's plan began to take shape. She waited, biding her time, measuring each action, hiding the storm that brewed within her. Her hatred, once a silent companion, became her driving force, guiding her through the days with a single, unwavering purpose. Though she continued to move through life as Nand expected, silent, obedient, and bound, there was a glint in her eye, a spark in her heart, a hidden strength waiting beneath the surface. Sahana was no longer the helpless girl Nan had once overpowered. She had become a woman forged by suffering, tasting betrayal, pushed to the brink of her endurance, ready to reclaim the life he had stolen. Her silence masked a growing resolve, a hatred feeding within her, ready to be unleashed. The night she had been waiting for had finally arrived. Moving through the shadows of her home with silent purpose, each step deliberate and measured, she prepared for the task ahead. The children were asleep, their tiny breaths soft and even, their innocence untouched by the suffering she bore. She lingered at their door, her gaze softening for a moment, but her heart hardened as she turned away, focusing once again on the task before her. Sahana entered the kitchen, her movements swift and precise. The knife felt cold and heavy in her hand, its metal a stark contrast to the fire burning within her. Her grip tightened as she remembered every insult, every touch, every stolen moment of happiness. She held the blade steady, breathing even, her mind sharp. This was the night that would change everything. She stepped toward the room where Nand Kishore slept, pausing at the doorway, her silhouette barely visible in the faint glow of the moonlight. He lay there, oblivious, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that mocked her. Tonight, he would breathe his last as a free man. Sahana stepped forward silently, her gaze cold, detached, her heart a fortress of hatred. Raising the knife, she brought it down, each movement deliberate, each stab a release. Her hand moved with precision, driven by the pain, the anger, the sorrow that had lived within her for so long. The room remained silent, save for her steady, deliberate breaths, as the weight of her years of suffering lifted with each strike. Standing over him, her eyes empty of pity, her mind clear, she realized she was free. The man who had haunted her days and tormented her nights was gone. Sahana was no longer his captive. She was herself again, a woman who had taken back her life, who had broken free from the chains that had held her in silence. She stepped back, breathing calmly, feeling the weight of her past finally fall away. The house was quiet, the world untouched by the violence that had unfolded within these walls. As the first light of dawn touched the edges of the sky, Sahana turned, leaving behind the shadows of her old life and stepping into a future that, for the first time, was truly her own. The dawn broke softly over the village, casting gentle shadows along the narrow pathways. But inside Nankishore's home, the air remained thick with an unnatural stillness, as though something had shifted forever. It wasn't until later that morning, when neighbors began their usual routines, that they noticed something was amiss. A young boy sent to call on Nant for an early meeting hesitated before knocking, his small hand faltering as the silence within felt strange, unnerving. Receiving no answer, he pushed open the door, his eyes widening as he saw the elder lying still, his once commanding presence now gone. Panic spread quickly through the village. Villagers gathered, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Some stood in silence, their hands over their mouths, while others murmured, eyes darting from face to face, searching for answers. For a man of such stature, respected and feared, this was unthinkable. The elder, who had shaped their lives, now lay lifeless, his final hours shrouded in mystery. Whispers began to circulate. Some dared to voice what had long been suspected. Perhaps this wasn't an accident. Perhaps the man who wielded so much power over Sahana had finally met his end at her hands. But not everyone was so understanding. As days passed, sides began to form within the village. Some spoke in hushed tones, saying Nand Kishore had brought this fate upon himself, that his actions had finally caught up with him. They murmured that Sahana, once a victim of his control, had reclaimed her life in the only way she knew how. Yet others, those who had benefited from Nand's influence, who viewed tradition and respect as unshakable pillars, were horrified. To them, she was a criminal, a woman who had committed an unforgivable act, regardless of her circumstances. When the authorities arrived, the investigation began coldly and methodically. They combed through the house, gathering evidence that inevitably pointed to Sahana. Bloodstains traced a clear path, fingerprints marked where she had steadied herself. Each trace served as a silent testament to the night she had waited for so long. She neither fled nor resisted. Sahana stood calm and composed, unsettling the villagers with her unreadable expression as they questioned her. Her answers were quiet, yet unwavering. When asked about her motives, she spoke plainly, recounting the years of torment, stolen dreams, and the quiet resentment that had festered into something stronger. Her words were steady, revealing the suffering that had been ignored for so long. She didn't beg for mercy, nor attempt to justify herself beyond the truth she had spoken. In that small courtroom, under the scrutiny of villagers and authorities alike, Sahana's story became a test of justice. The village was forced to confront its values, particularly its treatment of women, and its unwavering loyalty to figures of power. Some villagers saw her actions as a mirror, reflecting the flaws and hidden darkness within their traditions. To them, she became a symbol of rebellion, of a woman who had finally taken back control in a world that had long denied it. The courtroom became a battleground between tradition and justice. Some of the village elders, who had once revered Nand Kishore, struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the dark truths emerging from Sahana's testimony. They heard of the abuse, the forced marriage, and the isolation that had bound her. Yet, the idea of a woman taking justice into her own hands unsettled them. For them, tradition held more weight, and Nand's power, despite his death, could not easily be discarded. The proceedings were complex, a tangle of authority, tradition, and justice. Some elders spoke on Sahana's behalf, detailing the life she had led, the suffering she endured, and the mistreatment that had stripped her of everything. Others condemned her, their voices sharp with disapproval, arguing that her actions shattered the very fabric of their community. They viewed her as a criminal who had broken an unspoken law that prohibited acting against one's place in the social order. Outside the courtroom, villagers gathered, listening to the echoes of the trial that divided them. Some believed she deserved freedom, her actions justified by years of suffering and trauma. Others argued that vengeance could never be excused, regardless of pain. Sahana remained silent, her gaze steady, her face a mask of calm as the trial stretched on. Each day brought new testimonies and arguments. But she had told her story, and there was nothing more to say. Her motives had been laid bare, for those who had turned a blind eye to her suffering. She did not beg for mercy, nor attempt to justify herself beyond the truth she had spoken. In the courtroom, her story became a mirror of justice itself. The village grappled with its values, its treatment of women, its blind loyalty to figures of power. For some, Sahina's actions reflected the brokenness of their traditions. Sahina's dishonesty; for others, she was a symbol of rebellion, someone who had reclaimed control in a world that had long denied it. The villagers held their breath as the judge read the verdict. It was a decision weighed heavily, balancing tradition against justice, authority against compassion. Whatever the outcome, it would echo through the village, leaving an imprint that could not be erased. Sahana was sentenced to 15 years of confinement, walking a delicate line between punishment and understanding. The judge acknowledged her suffering, the years of entrapment, and the torment that had driven her to such drastic action. It was clear he saw her not as a common criminal, but as a woman who had been pushed beyond human endurance. The villagers reacted in different ways. Some were in quiet outrage, unable to reconcile the leniency of the sentence with their rigid expectations of justice. Others, particularly those who had long sympathized with Sahana, felt a bittersweet relief. She would face time behind bars, but her suffering had not gone unnoticed. As Sahana was led away, her gaze remained steady. In those moments, she felt, for the first time, a sense of liberation. The walls that had confined her for so long seemed to finally fall away. Sahana's story lingered in the minds of the villagers and beyond, leaving questions that could not be easily answered. Could this tragedy have been avoided if her family had been met with compassion instead of judgment? If cries for help had not fallen on deaf ears, would Sahana's life have taken a different path? They had requested aid from the local administration, but their peaceful reactions were forced into unimaginable choices. Was that desperation enough to justify the marriage that ultimately destroyed Sahana's life? The village remains divided. Sahana's story forces us to confront difficult questions. When does self-defense become justice, and when does it become a crime? Could her suffering have been prevented if her family had been supported? If the community had seen the shame in marrying their daughter to a man who abused her? Should victims continue to suffer under the guise of tradition? In the end, Sahana's story reminds us that the scars of trauma run deep, and no one should be left alone to bear the weight of abuse. There should be no forgiveness for those who destroy lives with impunity. Please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.